that. Not sure what that means for you personally. Not sure if you're up to it. Maybe you know what's up, but you're just a little spiritually sleepy. You just want to live your life for now. You'll get to that later, not quite into it yet. Well, there's another part of the story I think it's important for us as we think and believe that God is calling us to reach our city. And it's something you and I need to know. And it's this. People need what we have. You may not want to wake up. You may be sleeping on the mission. But we must not sleep on the mission while people need what we have. And they're all around us. What do we have? Well, if you have entered into a relationship with Jesus Christ, then you have a relationship with the one true God, the God who has created us. And because of this, you and I, we have the hope that can only come in that relationship, the hope for our salvation. We have the message of God's grace. We call it the gospel. And while we have this, you need to know that all around us there are people in our city, in our county, and beyond who do not yet have it. And it's been a part of God's plan from the beginning that He would call a people to Himself and He would save them, redeem them, but also as He called them to Himself and they began to worship Him, that He would also call that same people to be on mission for Him. That they would then in turn go back out into the world and bear witness, bear testimony about who God is and about how they can come to know God as well. But those people that are out there, they don't yet have what we have. They don't have a relationship with God. They haven't experienced salvation. They don't share our hope. They haven't heard the gospel of grace. They're like the sailors that we find in this story. You see, while Jonah was wasting precious time in his disobedience, you'll see these sailors, these mariners, they're running everywhere, none of them having any kind of hope. And they typify those who do not have a relationship with God. And there are a number of things that we learn about them here in these verses. One thing right off the bat is that they're afraid to die. Verse 5 tells us that the mariners were afraid. So you've got Jonah, and we learn later in the story, he's asleep in the hull, asleep. But while Jonah is sleeping peacefully, they're freaking out, running all over the place. While Jonah does nothing, they're doing everything, scrambling to save their lives, searching for any possibility that they could avoid death because they feared the unknown of what would happen to them. You got to remember, these are experienced sailors. This is not the first time they've been in a storm on the sea, but this is no ordinary storm. Whatever they're experiencing, and it is the Lord's storm being hurled down upon them, a great tempest. This is unlike anything that they had ever known before. They knew bad seas, and this was far beyond that. They'd never seen a storm like this before. They knew that death was certain. So they are afraid to die, certainly, but also perhaps afraid of what's going to happen to them. They're living without any kind of hope. I'll encounter people like them from time to time, not knowing what it's like after death. You know, the very first funeral I ever conducted as a pastor, had just recently been ordained as a pastor. I was serving at Liberty Point Baptist Church in Gaddis, Kentucky, a small little town, a rural church in a rural town. The very first person had passed away, an elderly man who was very active in the life of our church. And we were conducting the service. We did the service. It was about this time of year. It was really cold. I still remember the weather. It was probably late January, early February, and we went down to the cemetery down the street to do the interment service, the graveside service. And everything had gone so well, so smoothly up to this moment. And I prayed the last prayer, and we were dismissing the family and the friends who had shown up, church members. And that's when the daughter, this grown woman who was really not active in the life of our church, didn't go to church much. She was raised in our church, but left the church a long time ago, was inactive. As they were lowering the casket, she asked to stay to watch the casket to be lowered. And as they were getting ready to lower the casket, she began to scream out, "Oh, dear Lord, please do not let them put my daddy into the ground. Please do not put my daddy into the cold, 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 cold ground." And she was just inconsolable. I mean, the family wrapped their arms around her, and she was practically screaming and crying all the way to the car until they closed the door. And my heart broke for her. Because her father, who I had had a brief time to know, knew Jesus. And I knew that they were lowering into the ground was not that man. That was just his outer shell. He was in the presence of the God who had created him and saved him. While we were on this earth, putting his body in the ground, the man that existed was in the presence of Jesus. But the daughter didn't understand that. She had no hope beyond this life. And there are some in this world that are much like her. That's what the sailors were like. They did have some hope, by the way. They had that there was hope in some kind of God. And know that I say they hoped in a God. They didn't necessarily know there was a God of hope. Look on down to verse 5 again. It says the mariners were afraid, and each cried out to his God. Now, this was a common belief in those days. They believed that pagans often believed that each person had his own God. They may have believed in a hometown deity. And so there was a God of this town who was not the God of the next town down the road, and so on and so forth. And that in their mind, there was no one true God. For them, there were many gods. And if it weren't so humorous or so tragic, it would be a funny thing to see here. Each man running around praying to their God, acting crazy here. All of them looking for a magic bullet, hoping to stumble upon the right incantation. Maybe they would appease the right God, the God who created the storm. And that's why they decided to wake Jonah up. They wanted him to pray to his God, just in case it was his God who had thrown the storm at them. It was, right? But in their minds, as far as they knew, there were many gods out there. I heard one radio show talk host describe the religions of the world as being like a wheel. Like there is a God. He's the God in the center of the wheel, and there are many spokes. And these spokes represent the many religions or many ways to God, that there are many paths to God, and that it doesn't matter which path you choose, it's all valid. Maybe you've heard the analogy of God being on top of a mountain, and the different religions are like different pathways up to the same summit. That they may believe different things, but they're all sincerely making their way to the one God. The problem with that viewpoint is that's not the one true God's viewpoint. In fact, the one true God, Jesus Christ, doesn't give us that option of picking and choosing a different pathway to God. He himself said that I am the way, the truth, and the life, and no one comes to the Father except through me. There are not many pathways to God. There is but one, and that pathway's name is Jesus. Friends, we need to know that the testimony of the Bible is true, that the God of the Bible is the true God, and He is the one and only true God. There are no Hindu gods, or no Islamic God, or Buddhist God, no Mormon gods. There is just one God, Yahweh, the one and only God. The sailors didn't yet know this, by the way, but they're about to find this out. But in the meantime, they're desperately trying to whatever they can to do to save themselves. You'll notice there in verse 5 that they each cried out to his God, and they hurled the cargo that was in the ship into the sea to lighten it for them, trying anything they could do to desperately save themselves, crying out to their pagan gods, trying to lighten the load. Nothing is working. The ship is going down. And that really sums up every other faith but the true faith in Christ. People realize that they're in a bad place spiritually, banking their eternity on their ability to save themselves, hoping they've lived good enough lives to gain entrance into heaven. But friend, listen to me. No amount of good deeds on your part will suffice to earn your salvation. Not one thing. Because salvation comes by the grace of God and in His grace alone. And what Jesus Christ did upon the cross to make salvation possible for you. And yet I wonder if there might be anyone here today like those sailors. Perhaps you fear what's going to happen to you when you die. Maybe you hope that there's a God out there, that He wants what's good for you, and you hope that you've done enough to be right with Him. Well, friend, I'm telling you, there is hope for you, but it's not in just any God. It's in the one true God who can save you no matter how crazy the storm of your life may be. In fact, look at verse 7. It says that they said to one another, "Come, let us cast lots that we may know on whose account this evil has come upon us." And so they cast lots, and the lot fell on Jonah. And then they said to him, "Tell us on whose account this evil has come upon us. What is your occupation? Where do you come from? What is your country? And of what people are you?" So again, in their desperation, the sailors are seeking out answers, and they're casting lots to determine the favor. Casting lots, we don't really see that much today, but it's basically a game of chance where you take each person's assigned a stick and you throw it, but they were tossed, and the stick that lands on top is the one that is chosen. Well, when they did this, the lot fell to Jonah. Jonah was the one with the answer, so the lots tell them. Or maybe he was the one that was the source of the problem. So that's why they began asking questions. Well, what's caused this? What evil has caused this storm? What did you do? Where do you come from? What country are you from? What people are you? Remember, they are thinking that a God is tied to a particular place. So they wanted to know where Jonah was from so they can know which God he believed in and to see if it was his God that caused the storm. But the answer that they receive from him is what ultimately offers them hope, the source of the hope that they desperately needed. You see, Jonah didn't believe in just another tribal deity like they believed in. He believed in the one and only true God. Verse 9, he says to them, I am a Hebrew, and I fear the Lord. I fear Yahweh, the God of heaven, who made the sea and the dry land. Now, we won't get to this today, but further on down the story, we'll see this next week, that we learned that these sailors began to fear the Lord. They began to offer sacrifices to him. And it took the Lord's intervention in the storm to bring it about, not because Jonah was willing, but because God is willing. In fact, if you'll think about it, Jonah was running from God and he's asleep on the mission, all while these sailors needed what he had. He had a relationship with the one true God. He knew the one true God, had a relationship with the one true God, and had a message of grace and hope that the one true God would offer. He alone on that ship knew that his God was the only true God. That his God was not the same as their God, the ones that the sailors followed. Their gods were weak, but his God was strong. Their gods were imaginary, but his God was real. You see, for us, the lesson to be learned from this part of Jonah's story is this. Church, we cannot be asleep on the mission. We can't do it while people all around us need what we have. We have to share God's message with them. We must share the gospel with them. Otherwise, how will they hear? So what about you today? Anybody sleeping soundly? Any Christian here asleep on the mission? This story reminds us that you ultimately cannot hide from God. We'll see how this plays out further as the story goes on. But if you're trying to run from God and hide from God and be asleep on the mission, you're wasting your time and the Lord's time, and you're wasting your life. And what maybe needs to happen today is a turnaround. And friend, if that's the case, do not make God hurl the storm at you to bring you back. Or maybe there's someone here that's much more like the sailors. You're not sure what's going to happen to you when you die. You're hoping all of this works out. And at the end of your life, when the time comes for you to check out of this world, that enough has been done on your behalf or someone else's behalf in order for you to be right with God. But you're not quite sure. You don't quite know. Friend, I'm here to tell you, you can know him today. Because Jonah's God, the God of heaven, the God who made the sea and the dry land, the God who made even you, desires to save you and to know you. And that one true God has a name. And his name is Jesus. His name is Jesus. The story of Jonah is not the only part of the book of the Bible. The story will continue. And ultimately we know, many, many years, many centuries later, there will come one by the name of Jesus, who is God himself, who comes to the earth, being both God and man in the same person. And Jesus, who lived a perfect life, who laid out his life upon the cross, paying the penalty of the sin that you and I, that we owe against God, that we deserve to be separated from God for all of eternity over. God makes possible our forgiveness because of what Jesus does for us on the cross. He dies for us, was buried, comes back to life. And those who believe him to be God and have repented of their sins and turned to him, they will be saved. And they have the hope of God. If you do not know Jesus today, today is the day that you can turn to Him and see your life turned around for the glory of God. I'm going to ask you to join me in a word of prayer. And I just want to pray for those of us who have been called on mission.